All right, so welcome to our discussion on Unit 5, Revolutions. This is topic 5.1, where we are going to focus on the Enlightenment. So what is the Enlightenment? Well, the Enlightenment was an intellectual and philosophical movement that swept across Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries. It was characterized by a strong emphasis on reason, rationality, and the pursuit of knowledge. The Enlightenment thinkers, also known as philosophers, believed that human beings could use reason and critical thinking to solve problems, improve society, and make advancements in various fields, including science, politics, ethics, and philosophy. This was a new way of thinking in Europe, because previously religion, specifically Christianity, guided how people came to know about the world. Religious thinking relies on faith, revelation, and spiritual experiences as pathways to knowledge, while Enlightenment thinking emphasized empirical observation, evidence-based reasoning, and the scientific method as the means to acquire knowledge about the natural world and human society. Pictured here is René Descartes, an important philosopher who is regarded as a key figure in the emergence of modern philosophy and scientific thinking. The key takeaway for you from this definition is that the Enlightenment era brought major changes to how people thought about social and political ideas. So what leads to the Enlightenment? It's important for you to understand the relationship between these major events and periods in European history. The Renaissance was the cultural, artistic, political, and economic rebirth in Europe, which followed the medieval period. The rediscovery of classical texts led to major advancements in thinking and was a major factor in the Protestant Reformation. The Gutenberg printing press facilitated literacy and consequently the wider spread of information among the population. It was the fuel that allowed these new ideas to spread. The Protestant Reformation, as we learned in Unit 3, marked a huge change in religious thinking in Europe. This weakened the control of the Catholic Church overall. The scientific revolution brought many obvious scientific advancements and inventions, but it's the idea of empiricism and experimentation that are most important here. Okay, so what is empiricism? Well, empiricism is a philosophical approach that asserts that knowledge and understanding are primarily derived from sensory experiences and observations and experimentation. This is a key term which can and will show up in primary and secondary sources in both MCQs and FRQs. So I ask you, and I want you to write your response in your guided notes. What do you think empirical evidence refers to? So take a moment, think about that, and write your response in your guided notes. So the burning question of philosophers. Many philosophers have gotten stuck on the question of how do we know for sure what really exists? Descartes thought about this question and concluded that he could not be sure that his own senses, his sight, his touch, his hearing, etc., could be reliable. There certainly exists situations that feel very real to people, but we agree that they are not. For example, dreams and hallucinations, which are two great examples. So how can we be sure that what we are experiencing now is not a dream, a hallucination, or perhaps a very strange virtual reality experience? What Descartes felt certain that he did know for sure was that he was, in fact, actually thinking something. To him, this proved his existence, even if his senses could not be trusted. Basically, if he did not exist, he could not possibly be thinking about whether or not he existed. I know, that's a lot to take in, so maybe read that again and think about that. Take a deeper thought on it. The next slide proposes a thought experiment that's going to allow you to explore the idea of existence further, and it explains how this is all connected to the Enlightenment era. So make sure to fill out what is Descartes' answer to this question on your guided notes. So let's look at a thought experiment. Imagine there is a mad scientist living on a distant planet. On this planet, this mad scientist has your brain in a vat of liquid, and connected to your brain is a machine. With this machine, the mad scientist can simulate any experience, including the experience you are having right now. The experience of you sitting in your chair, listening to my lecture, and feeling of breathing in and out, your memories, your inner monologue. These are all a simulation of this machine. Do you not really exist? Are you simply a brain in a vat? Is there any way that we could prove that this was not actually the case? Is there any way to prove that we can trust that our own experiences are authentic? Would this bother you knowing that your experiences were manufactured? Why? I want you to think about this experiment. I want you to write down your response. So read this over, think about it really deeply, and write your responses on your guided notes. We are going to have this as a discussion in class when we come back next class period. So be prepared to share your response with your shoulder partner and with the entire class. So the thematic focus of this portion of the lecture is going to be on cultural developments, but with a strong connection to social, political, and economic developments. The background image is a painting by Jean-Pierre Huel, which depicts the storming of the Bastille in France. This is an iconic moment during the French Revolution. By the end of this portion of the lecture, I want you to be able to explain the intellectual and ideological context in which revolutions swept the Atlantic world from 1750 to 1900. Historically, the Enlightenment philosophies applied new ways of understanding and empiricist approaches to both the natural world and human relationships. They also re-examined the role that religion played in public life and emphasized the importance of reason. Philosophers developed new political ideas about the individual, about natural rights, and the social contract. The rise and diffusion of Enlightenment thought that questioned established tradition in all areas of life often preceded revolutions and rebellions against existing governments. Nationalism also became a major force shaping the historical development of states and empires. So we're going to begin by going over several key figures of the Enlightenment that contributed significant ideas that helped fuel the Enlightenment and the revolutions that followed. Francis Bacon is widely considered the father of empiricism, and he is a key figure of both the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. His ideas and methodologies laid the groundwork for the empirical approach to knowledge that would become central to the Enlightenment era. He emphasized the importance of empirical observation and inductive reasoning in the acquisition of knowledge. He advocated for systematic and methodical observation of the natural world, gathering data through experimentation and sensory experience. This empirical approach was a fundamental departure from the reliance on tradition, authority, and dogma that had characterized much of the pre-Enlightenment thought. Bacon's influential work, Novum Organum, from 1620, outlined his new approach to scientific inquiry. In this work, he proposes the idea of inductive reasoning, where general principles are derived from specific observations. He famously argued that knowledge is power. You should recognize that phrase. And the pursuit of knowledge should serve practical and utilitarian purposes for the betterment of society. So let me ask you this, and I want you to think about this, because we might talk about it in class. How might these ideas on how to better society have contributed to the political revolutions? be prepared to think about that and discuss that in class. So Bacon versus Descartes on empiricism. We have talked about these two figures in the context of empiricism, but how did their ideas differ? Answering this question is key to understanding the evolution of thought in the Enlightenment period. Francis Bacon and René Descartes' approaches to empiricism differed in some very fundamental ways. Bacon advocated for systematic data collection through experiments and sensory experiences. His approach was more focused on accumulating a large body of empirical data to derive general principles or laws from specific observations. Descartes, on the other hand, began his philosophical journey with a bit more skeptical outlook. He famously doubted all his sensory experiences, adapting a method of radical doubt. He sought to establish a foundation of indubitable knowledge by first doubting everything, even the existence of the external world, and then arriving at a certainty through reason. While he acknowledged the importance of empirical knowledge, his method started with a more rationalist approach. Both of these, the ability to accept and rely on data and observation to draw conclusions, and the skepticism which provides a pathway to reason to draw conclusions, were important to furthering the ideas of the Enlightenment, even though they are fundamentally different approaches. And that takes us to Thomas Hobbes and the social contract theory. Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher who lived during the 17th century and is often regarded as a precursor to Enlightenment philosophy due to his contributions to the social contract theory and his emphasis on reason, governance, and the relationship between individuals and the state. Hobbes' social contract theory is a central theme in Leviathan. He proposed that in a state of nature where there is no established political authority, humans exist in a condition of perpetual conflict and insecurity. Life in this state, according to Hobbes, is nasty, brutish, and short. To escape this state of nature, individuals voluntarily come together and enter into a social contract, relinquishing some of their natural rights and their powers to a central authority, typically represented by a sovereign or a government. This contract is an agreement among individuals to create a political entity for the sake of security and the protection of their natural rights. It's important that you understand social contract theory as a philosophical idea that in order to secure certain protections and a civilized society, some rights must be ceded to a central authority or government that protects the people and their rights. This idea is very important, and monarchies fit into Hobbes' view of a central authority. From Thomas Hobbes, we move to John Locke and the social contract theory. John Locke was a 17th century English philosopher whose ideas played a pivotal role in the Enlightenment and the development of modern political thought. His ideas on the social contract theory, which we discussed in context of Hobbes already, is outlined in his most famous work, Two Treatises of Government. Locke's social contract theory starts with the idea of the state of nature, which he describes as a condition where individuals are free, equal, and independent. In this state, people have natural rights to life, liberty, and property. However, the state of nature is also a state of insecurity because there is no established authority to arbitrate disputes or to protect these natural rights. Consequently, individuals come together to form a civil society and government, voluntarily agreeing to give up some of their freedom in exchange for protection and a more organized way of life. The next slide is going to give us some important details about his key ideas, which were greatly influential to the revolutions that we will cover later in this unit. So what are John Locke's key ideas? The key ideas about government from Locke include 1. Government isn't legitimate unless it has the consent of the governed. 2. Government should be limited in scope and respect to the fundamental rights of individuals. 3. It should be a system where different branches of government would be responsible for different tasks, thereby limiting the potential for abuse of power. 4. He argues that individuals have a right to own the product of their work. So, for example, if you work the land to produce an agricultural product, you should own that product. 5. His most radical idea: if a government fails to protect the rights and freedoms of its citizens, the people have the right to revolt and establish a new government. So I want to pose a question. I want you to pause the slide and think about this for a second. Does John Locke support a monarchy? Why or why not? So think about that for a second. The answer is probably no. He is here providing an early outline for a government that is chosen by the people. The idea that he says consent of the governed, rather than a government led by the divine right of kings. He is also proposing limiting powers of the government and using some kinds of checks and balances system to prevent the abuse of power, which is not how a monarchy typically operates. And no monarchy would support the notion that the people would ever have the right to revolt if they didn't like what was happening. So how does Hobbes and Locke look on the social contract issue? Social contract theory suggests that people come together to form a society and government by agreeing to follow certain rules in exchange for protection and shared benefits. Essentially, individuals give up some personal freedoms to create a more organized and secure community. Both Hobbes and Locke proposed ideas about what a social contract, a government, should look like. Some key differences between the two thinkers lie in the role of the people. Hobbes basically thinks people must live under a powerful, centralized authority, or else they will have a nasty, brutish, and short life. Locke, on the other hand, believes much more in the abilities of the people and proposes they take a greater role in determining how they are governed. Hobbes equals pro-monarchy, and Locke, he is anti-monarchy. We are now switching to Enlightenment thinking on the subject of economics, and this is where Adam Smith comes in. He was an 18th century Scottish economist and philosopher who wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, where he offered his critique of mercantilism. You may recall from Unit 4 that mercantilism was the driving economic idea of European nations as they colonized different parts of the world in an effort to gain a bigger piece of the pie by accumulating and stockpiling wealth. Mercantilism advocated for a positive balance of trade, where countries should export more than they import and accumulate wealth primarily in the form of gold and silver. Governments were encouraged to impose tariffs and quotas to protect domestic industries and to discourage imports. Smith argues against these mercantilist principles, proposing instead the idea of free markets guided by the invisible hand of supply and demand. He believed that if individuals pursued their own self-interests, this would inadvertently contribute to the greater good of society. The term laissez-faire originates from French, and it translates to let do or let it be. And it refers to an economic system where the government minimizes its interferences in the economy. While Adam Smith did not explicitly use the term laissez-faire, his economic philosophy laid the groundwork for the laissez-faire approach. He advocated for free markets, limited government intervention, and the power of individual choice and competition to regulate economic activity. Now let's focus on Thomas Paine and deism. Thomas Paine wrote The Age of Reason, a work that critiqued organized religion and championed rational thought. Paine posited that belief in a creator could be arrived at through reason and the observation of the natural world, rather than through religious dogma, tradition, and revelation. He argued that the complexities and beauties of the natural world indicated the existence of a creator, but that this creator had given humans the power of reason to understand the world, rather than intervening through miracles or scripture. This idea is called deism. Paine was highly critical of the Bible and other sacred texts, viewing them as human-made and thus subject to error and interpretation. He believed that these texts were used to manipulate and control people through fear and superstition. According to Paine, the true Word of God could be found in the laws of nature and in the world around us, not in texts written by human hands. How does this, and I want you to think about this, how does the idea of deism conflict with the idea of the divine right of kings? Pause this video for a second and think about that for a second. So the divine right of kings, it suggests that rulers are selected by God, meaning that God would be taking an active role in selecting a ruler. This is completely contrary to the idea of deism, where God exists but never intervenes or takes an active role in such matters. Now that we have run through a decent handful of influential Enlightenment thinkers and their major ideas, let's return to the first key concept, historical development of this topic. Enlightenment philosophies applied new ways of understanding and empiricist approaches to both the natural world and human relationships. They also re-examined the role that religion played in public life and emphasized the importance of reason. Philosophers developed new political ideas about the individual, natural rights, and the social contract. So at this point, I'd like you to take a moment and read the questions on the slide or in your guided notes here and answer them on your guided notes. The first question: which Enlightenment thinkers developed ideas about new ways of understanding and empiricist approaches? Which Enlightenment thinkers re-examined the role of religion? Which Enlightenment thinkers developed new political ideas about the individual, natural rights, and the social contract? Once you have finished filling in this slide, go ahead and move to the next one. So let's move on to discussing the French Revolution. The French Revolution is an excellent example of the results of all the new ideas that emerged from the Enlightenment era. Enlightenment ideas spread quickly, and the French citizenry began to question the established social hierarchy, which in France was divided into three rigid estates that provided privileges to the clergy and nobility while burdening the commoners. The idea that individuals had natural rights to life, liberty, and property challenged the basis of the authoritarian rule of the French monarchy and the rigid social structure of the ancient regime, which is the French for the old regime, which encompassed the monarchy and feudalism and other traditional French ideas. Liberty became one of the rallying cries of the revolution. Social contract theory argued that political authority should rest with the people, not a divine right monarchy. Enlightenment thinkers often criticized the church for its perceived corruption and role in upholding the status quo. The Revolution led to the confiscation of church lands and efforts to de-Christianize France. The Enlightenment placed a high value on reason and scientific inquiry. This led to a belief that rational laws could govern society and that social and political institutions could be engineered for the betterment of all. New ideas about governance and the rights of man contributed to a sense of French nationalism. The Revolution sought to replace the diverse legal codes and privileges for different regions with a single unified system. More on nationalism on the next slide. Montesquieu. We don't actually reference him directly, but he builds on Locke's ideas of preventing abuses of power in government. So Montesquieu's idea of separating the branches of government to prevent despotism was an influential principle that guided the revolutionaries in their restructuring of the French government. Although not as directly related, the economic theories of Adam Smith challenged France's mercantilist policies, making some revolutionaries question economic inequality and the lack of food security for the poor. Philosophers like Voltaire, also not directly referenced in our lectures, was openly critical of authoritarian rule and corruption. This influenced public sentiment against the monarchy and the privileged estates. The ancient regime was toppled and replaced initially with the National Assembly, which represented French commoners. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was drafted, which embodied the ideas of the Enlightenment. So this leads to growing nationalism. Here is a quick definition. I'd like you to write this down on the portion of your guided notes where you see growing nationalism. So nationalism, which plays a huge role in the revolutions of this period, nationalism created a sense of unity among people who shared a language, culture, or an ethnic background. The multi-ethnic empires that we have covered in the course so far were threatened by these waves of nationalist thought. The Ottoman Empire is an excellent example of a multi-ethnic empire that would suffer at the hands of nationalist ideas in this period and into the 20th century. So we're going to move on to our next section. The thematic focus of this section of the lecture is social organization. And by the end of this section, you should be able to explain how the Enlightenment affected societies over time. Historically, Enlightenment ideas and religious ideals influenced various reform movements. These reform movements contributed to the expansion of rights, as seen in expanded suffrage, the abolition of slavery, and the end of serfdom. Demands for women's suffrage and an emergent feminism challenged political and gender hierarchies. So the social results of Enlightenment ideas. The Estates General was a legislative and consultative assembly in pre-revolutionary France, representing the three traditional social estates in the realm. The clergy was the first estate, the nobility was the second estate, and the commoners was the third estate. Unlike a modern representative democracy, each estate had its own assembly and voted as a body rather than as individual representatives. First estate. This consisted of the clergy, both high-ranking, so bishops, archbishops, abbots, and lower-ranking, which would be like parish priests. The clergy were generally exempt from most forms of taxation, but could voluntarily contribute to the state. The second estate, this was the nobility, including both the titled aristocracy and other individuals with noble status, Like the clergy, they enjoyed various privileges, including tax exemptions and the right to collect feudal dues. The third estate, this was a broad category that included everyone not in the first two estates, ranging from wealthy merchants to poor peasants. The third estate bore the brunt of taxation and had very little to say in how they were governed. The Estates General was convened infrequently and had no fixed schedule or rules. It was usually called into session by the king in times of crisis, primarily for the purpose of approving new taxes or resolving other urgent matters. The Estates General had no real legislative powers. Its main role was advisory. The last Estates General was convened in 1789 and was a pivotal event leading to the French Revolution. More on that coming up. So the social rules of the Enlightenment ideas. The last Estates General was convened, like I said, in 1789 and was a pivotal event leading to the French Revolution. Amidst the financial crisis, King Louis XVI called the Estates General to Versailles to approve new taxes. The representative of the Third Estate, frustrated by their lack of influence and inspired by Enlightenment ideas, eventually broke away and formed the National Assembly, inviting members of the other two estates to join them. This act was a direct challenge to the traditional structure of French society and governance and set in motion a series of events that would lead to the end of the ancient regime, the abolition of feudalism, and the rise of modern France. While the French Revolution had many other results for France as a whole, the abolition of feudalism was a major social change that came directly from Enlightenment thought. All right, so let's go ahead and take a minute to do some multiple choice question practice while we're kind of moving along these slides. So here we have a primary source image, and it says, "You should hope that this game will be over soon. The Third Estate carrying the clergy and the nobility on its back." So you've got the Third Estate, the commoners, carrying the clergy and the nobility on they're bent over, carrying them on the back. They're kind of hunched over. So the question says, which of the following was most likely the purpose of the Estates General in pre-revolutionary France? So do you think it's A, to provide a balance of power as outlined by Enlightenment thinker Montesquieu? Perhaps it's B, to function as an advisory body to the king. Maybe C, to bring Enlightenment thinkers together to discuss matters of the state. Or do you think it's D, to ensure equality and justice under the law for every man and citizen of France? So think about that question for a second, and then I want you to read the answers, and then select the response that you think is correct. I'm going to pause here for a brief minute to let you think about it and answer the question. Okay, so hopefully you were able to determine that the answer was in fact B, to function as an advisory body to the king. So now let's take a look at a multiple choice practice source excerpt. Now this is from Slavery, Ideology, and Institutional Change: The Impact of the Enlightenment on Slavery in the Late 18th Century, Marano, by Colin McLaughlin in 1979. The excerpt reads, "In the case of slavery, Luso-Brazilian society. And Brazilians, if you take a look at the asterisk down below, Brazilians are a part or full Portuguese descent. So in the case of slavery, Luso-Brazilian society could not allow rapid nor radical change to occur. The potential for destructive social and economic upheaval could not be ignored. As a result, important features of slavery appear constant, making it difficult to determine the degree to which change occurred. The basic and inherent brutality of a servile system remained, as did the economic dependence of Portuguese America on forced African labor, which indeed carried through well into the 19th century. By the latter part of the 18th century, however, the philosophical conditions that surrounded the institution in Brazil underwent modifications that indicated an erosion of support for forced labor. In particular, the changes engineered by the Enlightenment modified the institution's social support and, in due time, slavery itself. So, looking through this excerpt, which is also in your packet if you want to read it again and highlight it, think about what is being said here. And then on the next slide, we have a couple questions, which are the same questions that are in your packet. Which of the following is the main claim the author makes in this excerpt? A. Portuguese America was not economically dependent on forced labor, and this led to the erosion of support for slavery. B. Slavery in Brazil was brutal. C. Despite Enlightenment ideas, no changes to slavery occurred because of the risk of social and economic upheaval. Or D. The institution of slavery experienced a gradual erosion of social support by the late 18th century due to changes caused by the Enlightenment. So, after reading and annotating the source and reading the question, which answer do you think is correct? Take about 20 seconds to answer this. Okay, so hopefully you did come up with D. The institution of slavery experienced a gradual erosion of social support by the late 18th century due to the changes caused by the Enlightenment. So let's examine the social effects of the Enlightenment. Three major changes to the social structures resulted from Enlightenment ideas. First, serfdom and feudalism in Europe and Russia came to an end. In France, feudalism had informally ended prior to the French Revolution, but the last feudal rights held by the nobility were formally ended in 1789. Russian serfdom lasted longer and wasn't abolished until 1861. The Enlightenment idea that people had rights to property and to the fruits of their labor contributed to the end of serfdom. 2. The abolition movement was influenced by several factors, with Enlightenment thinking being one of those. The slave trade, in which people were transported across the Atlantic, was banned, first beginning in the early 1800s. Soon after, individual nations began to ban slavery itself. In the Americas, Brazil was the last to ban slavery in 1888. As we saw in the multiple choice question excerpt, social attitudes towards slavery in Brazil were slower to change and development into meaningful change. 3. Women were inspired by the Enlightenment thinking to fight to extend ideas about individual rights and liberties to women in a new movement of feminism. More on that coming up in the next slides. So that takes us to the Seneca Falls Convention. The Seneca Falls Convention was held from July 19th to July 20th, 1848, in Seneca Falls, New York, and was the first women's rights convention in the United States and a pivotal event in the history of the American women's suffrage movement. Organized by activist Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, the convention attracted around 300 attendees. Here you can see shown partly in the image on the slide. Both men and women, and aimed to address social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women. The most significant outcome of the convention was the adoption of the Declaration of Sentiments, a document drafted by Stanton and modeled after the U.S. Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Sentiments listed grievances and demands, including the right for women to vote, to own property, to receive equal education, and to participate fully in public life. The convention marked the beginning of organized efforts for women's rights and suffrage in America, and its declaration laid down the ideological foundation for future activism. Despite facing immediate backlash and ridicule, the Seneca Falls Convention became a catalyst for the women's rights movement, eventually leading to significant social and legal changes, including the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, which granted women the right to vote. The quote included the passage. The quote on this slide is from Elizabeth Cady Stanton on day 2 of the convention. Some attendees thought that the demand for the right to vote would jeopardize progress towards other goals for women's rights. So, for more on feminist origins after the Enlightenment, there's a great reading that I'm going to have you guys do in class that will extend your learning about this. So that takes us to wrapping up this topic. Here are your key ideas for topic 5.1 for review. As always, make sure to write these down in a separate notebook so you have them for quick access on tests and things. The key ideas for review: the printing press, Renaissance, Protestant Reformation, and scientific revolution contributed to the Enlightenment. Characterized by empiricism, rationalism, the social contract, laissez-faire economics, deism, and other new ideas from prominent thinkers. Enlightenment thinking and nationalism, they fueled the French Revolution, and Enlightenment thinking changes social structures, the abolition of serfdom, the abolition of slavery, and the rise of demands for women's rights. As always, make sure to check out Heimler's topic 5.1 review video. You can find the link in the description. Have a great evening.